The name Stillwater, Iowa, used to conjure images of tranquil farmlands, vast cornfields stretching to the horizon, and a community where everyone knew your name. But now, it was a name whispered with a shiver, a ghost story told in hushed tones around bonfires. The town's heart, a small red brick schoolhouse built in the 1920s, had become its gravestone. It stood there, a silent monument to the day the impossible happened. Detective Marcus Thorne stared at the cold metal file in his hands. The town's whispers were nothing compared to the official reports. Ruth's revenge, the media had dubbed it, a sensationalist headline that painted a simple yet horrifying picture. Marcus, a man whose life was built on logic and procedure, hated the simplicity of it. He had been a city cop for 20 years, a veteran of concrete jungles and human depravity, but Stillwater was different. The silence here was louder than any urban chaos. He'd been brought in from Des Moines, an outsider, to finally close a case that had haunted the community for 7 years. The official story, the one the town desperately clung to, was that Ruth Miller, a seemingly ordinary teenager, had snapped. Abused by her father, bullied by her peers, and neglected by a community that turned a blind eye. She had finally reached her breaking point. The narrative said she had lured a group of 7 influential adults, the school principal, her father, a popular football coach, the mayor, 2 city council members, and the local pastor, to the old schoolhouse. There, she had allegedly locked them in and boiled them alive in a large, industrial-sized pot used for cafeteria cooking. It was an act of brutal, premeditated vengeance that defied all human reason. Marcus didn't buy it. His gut, a compass that had guided him through countless investigations, told him the story was a flimsy lie. The crime scene photos were a jumble of contradictions. The industrial pot, a massive steel cauldron, was a centerpiece of the horror, but the evidence around it didn't fit. The doors were found locked from the outside. The victims, all strong, capable adults, showed no signs of a struggle. The forensic reports were inconclusive, filled with could be and maybe. The town wanted to believe in a mad, vengeful girl. Marcus wanted to believe in the truth, no matter how ugly. His first step was to revisit the schoolhouse. It was a cold, late autumn day. The wind, a biting northern whisper, rustled through the brittle stalks of the surrounding cornfields. The sky was a bruised gray, heavy with the promise of snow. The school stood alone, isolated by the fields and the town's collective fear. Marcus walked the perimeter, his footsteps crunching on the gravel drive. He ran a gloved hand over the chipped red brick, feeling the cold, rough texture. The windows were boarded up, but gaps in the planks allowed him to peer inside. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, a silent ballet in a room where a massacre had occurred. He found the old school caretaker, a man named Harold, sweeping leaves from the front steps. Harold was an old-timer, his face a roadmap of worry lines. He eyed Marcus with the suspicion reserved for outsiders. "Detective," Harold said, his voice raspy. "Didn't think anyone would come back here. We all try to forget. That's the problem, Harold. You can't forget a thing like this." "The case is still open," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. "I need to know everything you remember about that day." Harold leaned on his broom, his gaze fixed on the boarded-up schoolhouse door. "Nothing to remember, just like the reports say. Ruth, she was different, quiet, kept to herself. But she wasn't a monster, no matter what they say. She wasn't." "Did you see her that day?" Marcus pressed. "No, not since the day before," Harold said, his eyes now welling up with tears. "I saw her walking home. She looked lost, like a ghost already." Marcus took out his notebook. "Who were the 7? Principal Thompson, Pastor Miller, that's Ruth's father, you know, Coach Johnson, Mayor Albright, and Councilman Jenkins and Peterson. Oh, and Mrs. Gable, the other councilwoman. The pillars of the community. All of them," Harold said, his voice trailing off into a bitter murmur. "It's what they get for—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "For what, Harold?" Harold met his gaze, his eyes a mixture of fear and defiance. "For forgetting what they did to her. They all knew. They all looked away. Marcus nodded slowly, his mind racing. The official narrative was that the town had been blindsided by a teenage girl's monstrous act. But Harold's words hinted at a conspiracy of silence, a collective guilt. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a grave where the truth had been buried. He had to dig it up, piece by piece. He thanked Harold and left him to his futile task of sweeping away the past. As he drove away, Marcus looked in his rearview mirror at the lonely schoolhouse. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting a stark, unsettling light on the scene. It made the old building look clean, innocent, as if the horror had never happened. But Marcus knew better. The echoes of that day were still there, and they were whispering a very different story than the one the town wanted to tell. He knew his job was not just to find out what happened, but why. And in a town that had buried its secrets so deep, that why was the most terrifying question of all. He had to unravel the web of lies and expose the truth, no matter how dark. We're just getting started on this journey into the secrets of Stillwater. If you're intrigued by the mystery of Ruth's revenge and want to know what truly happened, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next chapter. The truth is just beginning to boil to the surface. Marcus spent the next several days meticulously poring over the case files, not just the official reports, but the ancillary notes, the interviews, and the background checks of the victims. The Stillwater Seven, as the media had morbidly titled them, were, on the surface, the town's most upstanding citizens. Principal Thompson, a stern but respected educator. Coach Johnson, a local hero who had led the high school football team to a state championship. Mayor Albright, a charismatic leader known for his folksy charm. Pastor Miller, a man of God. And Ruth's own father, which was the most grotesque detail of all. Then there were council members, Jenkins, Peterson, and Gable, the trusted voices of the community. But Marcus knew that what's on the surface is rarely the full picture, especially in a place like Stillwater. He decided to visit the local diner, the Stillwater Spoon, a place where the town's secrets were likely simmered over coffee and gossip. The air inside was thick with the smell of fried eggs and yesterday's regrets. He ordered a coffee and sat at the counter, a quiet, observant figure in a place where everyone felt entitled to stare. He noticed a woman in a faded apron cleaning the tables with a practiced, weary motion. Her name tag read, Linda. "You're that detective from the city, aren't you?" she asked without looking up. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "That's right, Marcus Thorne," he replied. "Do you mind if I ask you a few questions, Linda?" She finally looked at him, her eyes dark and heavy. "About Ruth? Everyone's got a story about Ruth. I'd like to hear yours," Marcus said gently. Linda sighed, placing the cloth on the counter. Ruth Miller was a good kid. She was quiet, sure, but she was sweet. She'd come in here after school, order a milkshake, and just sit and read. You know, she loved books, always had her nose in one. What about her father, Pastor Miller? Linda's jaw tightened. He was a difficult man. He saw a lot of things as a sin, and he wasn't afraid to let people know it. He didn't talk much about Ruth, not in a loving way anyway. It was more about keeping her in line, controlling her. And the others? The mayor, the principal? They were all part of the same clique, Linda said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. They ran this town, the church, the school board, the town council. If you were with them, you were golden. If you weren't, well, life was hard. Marcus felt a cold thread of unease. He asked about Ruth's mother. She passed away from an illness when Ruth was little. Ruth was left with the pastor. He wasn't a good father, Linda said, her voice catching. He'd beat her, not like a normal punishment. It was vicious, and everyone knew. Principal Thompson, Coach Johnson, they all saw the bruises. They just called it discipline, and looked away. The sickening details from the file suddenly made sense. The reports had been sanitized, the truth laundered through a wash of he was a respected pillar of the community. Marcus pushed for more. What about the schoolhouse? Why there? It was the town meeting hall. They had a big potluck dinner there the night before, Linda explained, her eyes distant. It was the town's way of celebrating the end of the school year. The 7 of them were always there, front and center. Marcus's phone buzzed. It was his colleague, Detective Lopez, back in Des Moines. "Hey, Marcus, I pulled some records for you," Lopez said. Principal Thompson was about to retire. Mayor Albright was running for re-election against a young popular candidate. Pastor Miller was about to be audited by the church. Coach Johnson's team was under investigation for hazing, and the 3 council members were about to vote on a controversial zoning change that would have a huge financial impact. So, they were all under pressure, Marcus said, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place, not for the crime itself, but for the motive of a cover-up. "Anything on Ruth?" "Ruth Miller's medical records are a mess. They've been tampered with. The original doctor's notes show multiple hospital visits for accidental injuries, bruises, fractures. Her father always said she was clumsy. The new notes, the ones in the official file, just list them as minor injuries. It looks like a classic cover-up, Marcus. Someone cleaned house after the fact." "What about her psychological evaluation?" "There isn't one. The report states she was found dead at the schoolhouse. Cause of death, self-inflicted injuries. But the details are vague." "No autopsy report, nothing solid," Lopez said, her voice filled with professional indignation. Marcus's grip on his phone tightened. "Found dead. The official story is she disappeared after the crime. She was the one who allegedly did it." "Yeah, that's what's so weird. My source says there was a body, but it disappeared from the morgue before a proper autopsy could be done. They just declared her at large and closed the case on her end." A cold sweat broke out on Marcus's brow. The narrative of Ruth as a crazed avenger was a fabrication. She wasn't at large. She was a victim, and her body, the ultimate piece of evidence, had been removed from the chain of custody. Someone had gone to great lengths to silence her, even in death. This wasn't a small-town tragedy anymore. This was a conspiracy, a meticulously crafted lie to protect the powerful. The silence of Stillwater was a deafening roar of complicity. He was no longer just investigating a massacre. He was hunting a ghost, a truth that had been systematically erased. The 7 victims were not just victims of a crime, but also perpetrators of a dark secret. And Ruth was the tragic, silent key. The still air of Stillwater, so often a symbol of its rural peace, felt heavy with a sense of dread. Marcus had spent the last 2 days interviewing everyone he could, from the mail carrier to the local librarian. He discovered that the Stillwater 7 were not just victims. They were a cabal, a self-appointed moral authority that held sway over the town. Pastor Miller's influence extended beyond his church. He was the spiritual advisor to the entire group, a man whose judgment was considered absolute. Marcus knew that to understand what happened, he had to understand the core of their power and the darkness it concealed. He drove to the old rectory, a stately Victorian house with a perfectly manicured lawn, a stark contrast to the ugliness Marcus now associated with its former resident. Pastor Miller's son, a man named Thomas who had moved away years ago, had returned to settle the estate. Thomas was a quiet, unassuming man, his face etched with a mix of grief and something less definable. Maybe shame. "I don't know why you're here, Detective," Thomas said, his voice flat. "Everything you need to know about my father and Ruth is in the police report. I'm here because I don't believe the police report tells the whole story, Thomas. There are too many holes, too many questions," Marcus replied, his eyes fixed on Thomas's. "I'm not here to judge your father. I'm here for the truth. Your sister deserves it. Don't you think?" The mention of Ruth seemed to break through Thomas's stoicism. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You wouldn't understand. My father, he was a man of God. He believed in strict discipline. For a long time I thought it was for our own good. But then I left for college, saw the world." His voice trailed off. "He was a tyrant, especially with Ruth." "Did you ever see him hit her?" Marcus asked. Thomas looked away, his jaw clenching. Not directly, but I saw the bruises. My father would say she fell, that she was clumsy. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe my father was a monster. Marcus's gaze softened. Thomas, I know this is hard, but your father was a man who hid things. Do you know if he kept a diary or any private journals? Thomas shook his head. No, not that I know of. He was a very private person. He never wrote anything down. But as Thomas led him through the house, Marcus's trained eye caught a small detail. The wooden floorboards in the pastor's study were a different shade of color under a heavy oak desk. He crouched down, and with a small crowbar he kept in his bag, gently pried up the board. Underneath, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a small, leather-bound book. "What is that?" Thomas asked, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror. "I think this is what we've been looking for," Marcus said, his heart pounding. He opened the book and began to read. It was Pastor Miller's diary. The pages were filled with his spidery, precise handwriting. It wasn't a record of daily events, but a confessional of his sins, a testament to his twisted self-righteousness. He chronicled Ruth's every transgression, from talking back to him to being too familiar with a boy in her class. The beatings were described not as acts of violence, but as a cleansing of the spirit, a way to save his daughter from her inherent wickedness. The descriptions were chillingly clinical, a man who saw no wrong in his cruelty. But the most disturbing entry was dated just 3 days before the Schoolhouse tragedy. It detailed a secret meeting of the Stillwater 7. The entry read, "The Lord's work is heavy. We must act. Ruth's insubordination has become a threat to the community. Her heart is full of sin. She knows too much about our arrangements. Thompson's financial troubles, Albright's affair, Johnson's secret. She threatened to expose us. We must contain the damage. For the good of Stillwater. We have decided on a course of action. It will be a lesson for all to see." Marcus's blood ran cold. This wasn't a story of a girl who snapped. This was a story of a powerful group of people who had conspired to silence a teenager who knew their darkest secrets. The schoolhouse was not the scene of Ruth's revenge. It was the scene of their plan. The boiling pot was not an act of her madness, but a part of a macabre ritual they had devised to make a public example of her. He kept reading, his hands trembling. The final entry was a single cryptic sentence. "The final solution is in place. No one will ever know the truth. The town will believe a lie, and we will be free." Marcus slammed the book shut, his mind reeling. The entire narrative of Ruth's revenge was a grotesque lie, a cover-up for a premeditated murder. The 7 victims were not killed by Ruth. They were the architects of her death. But if they had succeeded, then who had killed them? The diary was proof of their conspiracy, but it didn't explain the massacre. The question now was not who killed Ruth, but who killed the Stillwater 7 and why. A new, far more terrifying twist had just unfolded. The killer was not Ruth, but someone who knew what they had done, someone who was willing to deliver a far more brutal form of justice. The pastor's diary was a bombshell, a narrative-shattering piece of evidence that flipped the entire case on its head. It wasn't Ruth who was the monster, but the so-called pillars of the community. They had planned to silence her, to stage a grotesque public spectacle to make an example out of a girl who had dared to expose their secrets. But the diary left one crucial question unanswered. If they had killed Ruth, who had killed them? Marcus drove to the Stillwater Public Library. The librarian, a stern but kind woman named Eleanor Vance, had been a mentor to Ruth. She had taught Ruth to read as a child and had been her confidant. She hadn't spoken to the police much, claiming she didn't know anything. Marcus had a feeling that was a lie born of fear. He found her in the children's section, arranging books on a low shelf. Her movements were slow, deliberate. "Eleanor," Marcus said, his voice soft. She didn't startle. It was as if she had been waiting for him. "Detective," she said without turning around. "I told the others everything I know." "You told them what they wanted to hear," Marcus countered. "Now I'm here for the truth." I know you were close to Ruth. I also know that you're a friend of Harold, the school caretaker. He told me you and Ruth were kindred spirits." Eleanor finally turned, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were sad, resigned. "Harold talks too much. He's a good man, but he has a conscience." "And you don't?" Marcus asked. "I have a family detective," she said, her voice dropping. "Living in a small town like this, you learn to keep your mouth shut, especially when the people who run it are as vindictive as the seven were." Marcus took a seat on a small, child-sized chair. "I found Pastor Miller's diary. I know what they planned to do to Ruth. I know they were going to kill her. The question is, who killed them?" Eleanor's facade of composure cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes and she turned away, staring at the rows of books, a silent testament to the stories that could be told and the ones that had been silenced. I can't tell you," she whispered. "It would put my family in danger." "They're all dead, Eleanor," Marcus said. "The Stillwater 7 are gone. Their conspiracy is over. The only thing that's still here is the truth. And the person who did this is still out there. They could be a victim of a terrible injustice, or they could be a serial killer waiting to strike again. I have to know." Eleanor's shoulders sagged. She took a deep breath. The night of the potluck. It was a ritual. They believed that by purifying Ruth, they could absolve their sins. They had her in the schoolhouse, all 7 of them. They had a rope. They were going to hang her, but not before. They were going to make a spectacle out of it. They were going to make it look like a suicide, a public hanging, a lesson to the community. Marcus's blood ran cold. The image was horrifying, a town's darkest secret played out in the most public of ways. But they didn't, did they? "No," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "Because someone was watching. Someone who knew everything they were doing. A group of people who loved Ruth and couldn't stand to see her abused anymore." "Who?" Marcus asked, leaning forward, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Eleanor walked over to a stack of books on a nearby cart. She picked up a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. "Ruth and I had a secret language. We'd leave messages in books in the library. Sometimes she would leave me a note in a book. It was our way of communicating without her father knowing." Marcus's eyes widened. "Did she leave you a note about the night she died?" "She did," Eleanor said, a tear tracing a clean path down her cheek. "But it wasn't from Ruth. It was from someone else. It was the group who had been protecting her. They had taken her from her father, hidden her away. She was going to leave Stillwater for good." "So Ruth is still alive?" Marcus asked, his mind racing, trying to comprehend this new, staggering revelation. "I don't know," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "The note was from them. It said they had taken her and she was safe, and that the 7 would pay for what they had done. It said, they tried to silence a girl, but they woke up an army. It was signed by the Stillwater Silent." Marcus felt a thrill of a new kind of terror. The killer wasn't a single person. It was a group, a collective, an army of people who had conspired to murder the Stillwater 7. The diary had confirmed their intent to kill Ruth, but it had also inadvertently revealed their own motive for murder. The Stillwater Silent, an underground resistance, a secret cabal in this small, seemingly peaceful town. And they were the ones who were boiling people alive. He now had 2 parallel mysteries. One, a group of town leaders who were about to kill a teenage girl to protect their secrets. The second, a secret society that had murdered them first. The deeper he dug, the more terrifying the truth became. The killer wasn't a single monster, but a hydra, a collective of people who had decided to take justice into their own hands. And the most chilling question of all was, who were they? The revelation of the Stillwater Silent was a seismic shock. It shattered the perception of a single crazed girl acting out of revenge and replaced it with something far more intricate and terrifying, a clandestine group of vigilantes. Marcus now had a name for the murderers, but no faces. His next step was to find out who belonged to this secret army. He knew that a group like this wouldn't just form overnight. There had to be a catalyst, A moment when the town's silence turned to defiance. He went to the Stillwater Historical Society, a small, dusty building run by a reclusive man named Arthur Gable, a distant relative of Mrs. Gable, one of the Stillwater Seven. Arthur was a frail man in his 70s, with a mind like a steel trap. He had archived everything about Stillwater for the last 50 years. "Detective Thorne," Arthur said, his voice raspy. "I've been expecting you." "You have?" Marcus asked, surprised. "Everyone comes to me when they want to understand Stillwater," Arthur replied with a wry smile. "But no one ever asks about the things we don't put in the public record." Marcus took a seat across from him. "Tell me about the Stillwater Silent, Arthur. What do you know about them?" Arthur's eyes, magnified by his thick glasses, stared into the distance. "They're a legend, a myth. No one ever talks about them. They're the ghosts of Stillwater, the people who saw the darkness and decided to do something about it. They rose out of the shadows about 10 years ago after a series of accidents in town. A construction worker fell from a roof. A local reporter's car brakes failed. A young woman drowned in the lake. All connected to the Seven in some way. They were all about to expose something. Did anyone ever find out who they were? No, they're a ghost, but they leave a signature. They call it reenactments. They make their victims pay for their crimes in a way that's poetic and public. They don't just kill, they send a message." Arthur looked at Marcus, his gaze piercing. "The boiling pot, detective. It wasn't about revenge for Ruth. It was a message. A sick, twisted message." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What message?" "They used that pot to make stew for the town's children, for the school lunches. The Seven cut the funding for the school lunches and rerouted it to their private projects. They starved the children to line their own pockets. The Stillwater Silent didn't just kill them. They made them pay for their sins with the very thing they stole." The grotesque brutality of the crime suddenly made sense. It wasn't a random act of a mad girl. It was a symbolic execution, a dark form of justice. Marcus now had a motive, but the question of who was involved remained. He knew he had to find the members of the Stillwater Silent. "Arthur, I need to know who was involved in these accidents. The people who died, what secrets were they about to expose?" Arthur shuffled through a stack of old news clippings. The construction worker was about to expose Principal Thompson for taking bribes to rig school contracts. The reporter was about to expose Mayor Albright's affair and his embezzlement of town funds. And the young woman, she was a nurse. She was about to expose something about Pastor Miller, something to do with his wife's death. It was ruled a natural death, but the Silent believed it was murder. He had a thing for older, richer women. He'd marry them and then they'd just fade away. Marcus felt the weight of the conspiracy growing. The Stillwater Seven weren't just a powerful clique. They were criminals, and their victims had been silenced by a ghost. But the ghost had a name now, the Stillwater Silent, and Marcus was determined to find a face. "What about Ruth? What was she about to expose?" Marcus asked. "She knew everything. She was a quiet girl, a ghost herself, who saw everything. She knew about her father's crimes. She knew about their affair, their embezzlement. She knew all of it, and she was going to expose them. She had evidence. That's why they had to silence her," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "But she had friends, people who saw what was happening, people who were sick of the lies, people who had been victims themselves." Marcus felt a jolt of recognition. He thought of Linda, the waitress at the diner, and Harold, the school caretaker, and Eleanor, the librarian. They all had something in common. They were all on the periphery. They were the people who saw everything, but were never truly a part of the town's inner circle. They were the silent majority, the ones who had suffered in silence. Marcus thanked Arthur and left the Historical Society, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. The Stillwater Silent, a group of ordinary people who had been pushed to their breaking point. They had saved Ruth, or so they thought, and then they had killed her abusers. But why did they stage the scene to look like Ruth's revenge? Why the monstrous public spectacle? The answers were still shrouded in mystery, but Marcus had a new set of suspects, and they were the most unlikely ones of all. The very people who had appeared to be the town's kind and helpful folk. The quiet ones, the ones who had nothing to lose, the ones who had already lost everything. Marcus knew the time for subtlety was over. He had to confront his suspects directly. He went to the diner and asked Linda to step out with him. The cold wind bit at their faces as they stood on the sidewalk, the silence between them thick with unspoken truths. "Linda, I need to talk to you about the Stillwater Silent," Marcus said, his voice firm but not accusatory. Linda's eyes hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Marcus said, his gaze unwavering. "I think you, Eleanor Vance, and Harold, the school caretaker, are part of it. I think you're the ones who killed the Stillwater 7. Linda's composure broke. Her hands trembled and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "You're wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Am I?" The 7 were all about to be exposed. Thompson, Albright, Johnson, your boss at the diner. They were all involved in some way. They were all about to lose everything, Marcus said. And you all had a motive. Harold saw the beatings. Eleanor taught Ruth. You saw how they treated her, how they ignored her. You were the ones who saw the truth. Linda didn't deny it. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a raw, defiant rage. "We did it for Ruth," she said, her voice stronger now. "We couldn't let them hurt her anymore. We tried to stop them. We went to the police, to the church, to the school board. They all just laughed at us. They said Ruth was a problem child, a liar. They said we were just trying to stir up trouble. So you took matters into your own hands," Marcus concluded. "You saved Ruth and then you killed them." "Not exactly," Linda said, her voice dropping. "We didn't kill them. We were there to stop them, to save Ruth. We had been watching them for months. We knew about their plan to kill her. We had to act." She began to tell him the story, her words tumbling out in a torrent of long-held secrets. The Stillwater Silent wasn't a vigilante group, but a small circle of friends who had become guardians of the town's conscience. They had tried to protect others in the past, but the Seven's power had always been too great. This time, with Ruth, they were determined to succeed. They had been secretly planning to expose the 7. But Ruth had taken matters into her own hands. She had stolen Pastor Miller's diary and other documents, and she had run to them, terrified. She had a backpack full of evidence, Linda said, her voice cracking. She had their secret files, their bank statements, everything. She was going to go to the media, but she was so scared. We told her to give us the documents and to hide. We told her we would handle it. "And you did," Marcus said, his gaze softening. "We met them at the schoolhouse," Linda continued, tears now streaming down her face. "We thought we could expose them. We thought we could make them pay. But they were powerful men. They had a rope. They were going to hang Ruth. They were going to make it look like she took her own life. We had to stop them. We weren't armed. We were just 3 ordinary people against 7 powerful men. We fought them. We struggled with them. They were big and strong. We were losing. And then..." She stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. Marcus waited, his heart pounding. The truth, the real truth, was just a whisper away. "And then who?" Marcus asked, his voice urgent. Linda finally met his gaze, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and disbelief. "They were gone," she said, her voice a horrified whisper. "One minute we were struggling with them, and the next they were just gone. They disappeared. We looked around. They weren't there. We looked in the pot. We looked everywhere. We didn't know what to do. We were scared. We thought they had somehow escaped." Marcus felt a cold thread of dread. This wasn't a confession. It was a witness account. They hadn't killed them. They had just been there. If they were telling the truth, then the Stillwater Silent were not the killers. Then who was? The official story was that they were boiled alive. The scene was staged to look like Ruth's revenge. But why? And if they were really the ones who took the documents, where were they? And where was Ruth? "Linda, where is the backpack?" Marcus asked. I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "We left it there. We were in a panic. We just ran. We thought the 7 had escaped. We thought we had failed. We went home. We stayed there. We didn't talk to anyone. We were so scared. And then we found out about the massacre. We didn't know how it happened. We just assumed someone else had found out and killed them. We didn't want to get involved. We thought it was over. We didn't know about Ruth. We didn't know if she was okay." Marcus's mind reeled. He now had 2 distinct narratives: the official story of Ruth's revenge, and the Stillwater silent story of a rescue gone wrong. Both stories didn't account for the massacre. He was back at square one. A cold, bitter wind tore through the streets of Stillwater. He had to go back to the schoolhouse, the scene of the crime. The truth was not in the past, it was in the present, a silent, chilling presence that was still there, waiting for him. The Stillwater silence confession had thrown the case into a new kind of chaos. If they hadn't killed the 7, then who did? And if they had rescued Ruth, where was she now? Marcus felt the weight of the unsolved mystery pressing down on him. He decided to revisit the crime scene, this time with a new perspective. He wasn't looking for evidence of Ruth's revenge. He was looking for evidence of a second party, an unseen witness who had turned the schoolhouse into a killing ground. He returned to the schoolhouse, the grim building standing alone against the bruised sky. This time, he didn't just walk the perimeter. He went inside, the rusted lock giving way to his heavy-duty bolt cutters. The air inside was cold, stagnant, and smelled of dust and decay. The place was a museum of a long-ago tragedy. He walked past the overturned cafeteria tables, the scattered chairs. He found the industrial pot, a massive steel cauldron in the corner. He ran his hand over the cold surface, a shudder running through him. The official story said it was filled with boiling water, but the forensic reports had been inconclusive. He walked the perimeter of the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He noticed a small, recessed crawl space under the floorboards near the pot. It was hidden by a thick layer of dust and a small, forgotten crate. He moved the crate and, with his crowbar, pried up the floorboards. The space was tight, dark, and filled with a nauseating metallic smell. He shined his light into the space. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, in the cramped space, were 3 large steel barrels. One was labeled lye, another was labeled sulfuric acid, the third was unlabeled, but he knew what it was. It was a toxic cocktail. The smell was the telltale sign of a chemical burn. The Stillwater 7 weren't boiled alive. They were dissolved. The pot had been a decoy, a grotesque theatrical lie. The killer hadn't used boiling water. They had used something far more sinister, far more calculated. The forensic report had mentioned inconclusive because the bodies had been turned to a slurry. The killer had meticulously cleaned the scene, leaving only the narrative of a mad girl's revenge. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. He backed out of the crawl space, his mind reeling. He had been looking for a person, but now he was looking for a ghost who had the mind of a meticulous chemist, a person who had planned this for a long time. The motive was still revenge, but the act itself was a different kind of horror. It wasn't about a violent outburst. It was about cold, calculated elimination. He realized the Stillwater Silent were telling the truth. They had been a rescue party, a group of ordinary people trying to do the right thing. But someone had beaten them to it. Someone had watched the 7 and the Stillwater Silent, and had used the chaotic moment to execute their own plan. As he was about to leave, his flashlight beam caught something glinting under a loose floorboard near the door. He pried it up and found a small, tarnished silver locket. He opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of a young woman with a kind smile. She was holding a newborn baby. He recognized her instantly. It was the young nurse, the woman who had died in a supposed drowning accident, the woman who had been a victim of the Stillwater 7. The woman Pastor Miller had allegedly murdered. Suddenly, it all clicked. The pastor's wife who had died of a mysterious illness. The nurse, the Stillwater silence confession. And now, this locket. He ran the names through his head again. The 7, the Stillwater silent, the victims. And then, he remembered the name from the pastor's diary, the woman Pastor Miller had been having an affair with, a woman he had grown to resent, and then, according to Arthur, had gotten rid of. The name of the nurse was Clara. But the baby in the picture, Marcus's heart pounded. He knew who the baby was. He knew her name. The baby in the picture was Ruth. The nurse, Clara, was Ruth's biological mother. The story had another layer of betrayal. Pastor Miller wasn't just an abusive father. He was a murderer. He had killed Ruth's mother, and then he had raised her as his own, a constant reminder of his sin. He had abused her not just because he was a tyrannical man, but because he was a guilty one. Ruth knew. She must have known somehow, and that's why she was so determined to expose him. Marcus now had 2 killers, the pastor who killed his wife and a new, unknown person who had killed the 7. But who was it? Who would have known about all of this? The Stillwater silent were the guardians of the town's conscience. They would have known about the nurse, about the pastor's wife, but they didn't have the stomach for murder. So who did? As he stepped out of the schoolhouse, the wind howled through the cornfields. He looked at the vast, empty space around him, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather running through him. The truth was not just buried. It was hidden in plain sight. And the killer was still out there, a phantom of justice who had not only killed, but had masterfully orchestrated the perfect crime and the perfect cover-up. And Marcus knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the person who killed the 7 was the very person he had been looking for all along. The true avenger. The one who had the motive, the means, and the ability to pull off such a heinous act. The one who wasn't Ruth. It was the nurse's daughter. It was Ruth's brother. We're just beginning to uncover the full scope of this intricate web of lies and murder. The truth is far more complex and terrifying than anyone in Stillwater imagined. If you want to know who the real killer is and how they pulled off this perfect crime, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the thrilling conclusion. Marcus knew who the killer was. It all fit. The meticulous planning, the scientific precision of the crime, the personal connection to the victims. The killer wasn't a random vigilante. He was a family member. He was the son of the murdered nurse, the half-brother of Ruth, the silent avenger who had watched his mother's killer and his accomplices destroy his half-sister's life. Marcus drove to the Stillwater cemetery. He found the gravestone he was looking for. Clara Miller, a name that didn't appear in any official records as Pastor Miller's wife. The headstone was new, a small, unassuming granite slab in a forgotten corner of the cemetery. It was a silent act of defiance, a quiet burial for a woman who had been erased from history. He found a man kneeling by the grave, a bouquet of fresh flowers in his hand. He was in his mid-20s, his face a grim mask of silent grief. "John Miller?" Marcus asked, his voice low. The man stood, his eyes so full of sorrow, meeting Marcus's with a flash of defiance. "How do you know that name?" "I know a lot of things, John. I know your mother was Clara, a nurse who worked for Pastor Miller. I know she died a mysterious death, and that Pastor Miller took you and your sister Ruth and raised you as his own children. I also know that he killed your mother," Marcus said, "and I think you're the one who killed the Stillwater 7. John didn't flinch. He just stood there, the bouquet of flowers trembling in his hand. He looked at the grave, and then at Marcus. "You have no proof," he said, his voice flat. "I have the motive," Marcus replied. "I have the means, the chemicals, the knowledge to use them. I'm a detective, John. I can connect the dots. You were a chemistry major in college. You were away from Stillwater when your mother died. When you came back for the funeral, you saw Ruth. You saw the bruises. You saw the same look on her face that you saw on your mother's before she died. You knew, and you vowed to make them pay." John finally looked at him, his eyes now filled with tears. He told me she died in an accident, but I saw her diary. She wrote about her affair with him, about how she was pregnant with his child. She was going to leave him. He couldn't let that happen. It would have ruined him, so he poisoned her with chemicals, something he got from the school's chemistry lab. He had access to everything, and then he took me and Ruth. He raised us to be a reminder of his crime, a constant punishment for his sins. And Ruth, Marcus said, she found out too, didn't she? She found your mother's diary and the documents she was going to use to expose him. That's why she ran to her friends, the Stillwater Silent. Yes, John said, his voice a low growl of pain. She ran to me. She was terrified. She was going to the media. I told her no, he would kill her. I told her I would handle it. I told her to get a head start, to leave town. I gave her some money, and I took the documents. I knew what I had to do. I had been planning it for years. I was going to expose them, all of them, in a public way, a way they would never forget. But then I heard their plan, the hanging. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let them kill my sister. So you went to the schoolhouse, Marcus said. I did. I hid in the crawlspace under the floorboards. I was waiting for the right moment. The Stillwater Silent were there. They were trying to stop them. There was a fight, a struggle, and in the chaos, I acted. They were so focused on the Silent, they didn't see me. I pulled the levers. I turned on the gas, and I threw the chemicals into the pot. I sealed them in. I made them pay for their sins, with the very thing they tried to steal, the future of the children. They were going to steal from the children, so I made them pay with their lives, with a death that was a slow, agonizing poison, a symbolic justice. Marcus felt a grim satisfaction. The pieces finally fit. The scientific precision, the motive, the twisted poetic justice. John had meticulously planned this for years. He had waited for the perfect moment, and he had gotten away with it. And Ruth? Where is she now? Marcus asked. She's gone, John said. She's in a small town, a place where no one knows her. She's safe. She's finally free. I told her I would handle this, that I would avenge our mother, and I did. I made them pay, all of them. Marcus looked at the quiet, grief-stricken man in front of him. He wasn't a monster. He was a son, a brother, a man who had been pushed to his limits by a system that had failed him and his family. He had taken a terrible, final revenge. The case is closed now, John, Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. The police will find you. You know that. It's a matter of time. John nodded slowly, a small, sad smile on his face. I know, but I'm not running. I did what I had to do. For Ruth. For my mother. For all the victims. I was the one who had to act. I was the one who had to make them pay. Marcus knew he had to arrest him. It was his job. But as he looked at the man who had lost everything, he felt a strange sense of empathy. John wasn't a killer. He was a survivor. A victim of a system that had protected the powerful and left the weak to fend for themselves. He had finally gotten justice, and in doing so, he had become a criminal himself. The perfect crime had been a tragedy for everyone involved. The arrest of John Miller sent a shockwave through Stillwater. The quiet, grieving man they had all known was now a confessed killer. The media descended on the town, not with a story of a crazed girl, but of a calculated, premeditated massacre orchestrated by a survivor of a family's dark secret. The perfect crime was now a perfect tragedy, a testament to the town's buried sins. Marcus stood in the Stillwater police station, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. He had just finished his statement, detailing John Miller's confession. The local law enforcement was in a state of stunned disbelief. The lie they had clung to for 7 years had just been shattered by the truth. You're sure about this, detective? The sheriff, a grizzled old man with a face like a dried apple, asked. I'm sure, Sheriff, Marcus replied. The evidence, the motive, the confession, it all fits. He did it, and he did it for Ruth and his mother. The sheriff sighed, running a hand over his tired face. 7 years we've lived with this. The whole town we just wanted to forget. We wanted to believe the story. It was easier. Easier to believe a little girl was a monster than to admit the town leaders were, Marcus said, his voice devoid of judgment. The sheriff looked at him, his eyes filled with a sad understanding. They were good men, in their own way. They did a lot for the town, but they had their secrets. We all do. We just didn't think they were this dark. Marcus left the police station and drove to the Stillwater cemetery. The news had already spread. People were gathered around the new gravestone, their faces a mixture of sorrow and shock. They were looking not at a killer's grave, but a victim's. The truth had finally set her free. He found Harold, the caretaker, sitting on a bench near Clara's grave. He was holding a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of a younger Ruth, with a small, happy smile on her face. "He told you everything, didn't he?" Harold said, his voice a low rumble. "He did," Marcus replied. "He told me about you too, about how you and Eleanor and Linda tried to protect Ruth. He said you were the Stillwater Silent." Harold looked at the picture in his hand, a tear tracing a path down his wrinkled cheek. "We tried, Detective. We really tried. We went to them. We begged them to stop. We told them Ruth wasn't well. But they didn't care. They just looked at us like we were crazy. They said we didn't understand the big picture." "They were right," Marcus said. "You didn't. You didn't know about John. And you didn't know about his mother." "No," Harold said, shaking his head. "We didn't. We thought the seven had just escaped. We thought we had failed Ruth. We just wanted to forget. We wanted to believe the lie. It was easier than facing the truth." Marcus nodded. He understood. The truth was a complex, tangled mess of betrayal, murder, and justice. The town had chosen to believe in a simple, straightforward narrative of a mad girl. They had chosen to believe in the lie because the truth was too painful, too ugly. He left the cemetery, the weight of the case finally lifting from his shoulders. He had found the truth. He had found the killer. He had found the motive. He had found a family destroyed by a web of lies and murder. He had found a town willing to sacrifice the innocent for the sake of its reputation. The Stillwater tragedy was no longer a mystery. It was a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide in the hearts of the powerful, and the terrible consequences of looking away. He drove out of Stillwater, the cornfields stretching out on either side of the road, a vast, silent ocean of green and gold. The sky, once bruised and grey, was now a brilliant blue, a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed the town. He was leaving Stillwater, but he would never forget the people he had met, the secrets he had uncovered, and the truth he had found. The case was closed, but the echoes of Stillwater would haunt him forever. 7 years later, Marcus Thorne, now a retired detective, sat on his porch in a quiet suburb of Des Moines. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow across his lawn. The Stillwater case was a distant memory, a ghost in his past. John Miller was serving a life sentence, his confession a matter of public record. The small town had never fully recovered. The schoolhouse was still standing, a grim reminder of the day its secrets were finally exposed. Marcus received a letter. The envelope was plain, a simple white rectangle with no return address. He opened it, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't received a letter from Stillwater in years. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, elegant. It was from Ruth. "Dear Marcus," the letter began, "you may not remember me. I was a girl you looked for, a ghost in your past. I am writing to you from a different life, a different name. I am safe now, thanks to you and my brother. He told me everything. He told me he killed them. He told me he did it for me, for our mother. I want you to know that he didn't just save me from them. He saved me from myself." Marcus's heart ached for the girl he had only known through crime files and a town's cruel whispers. He read on. "I was going to kill them myself," the letter continued. "I had been planning it for months. I was going to use the chemicals. I was going to make them pay for what they did to my mother. I was going to make them pay for what they did to me. My brother, he saw my anger. He saw my pain. He saw my descent into darkness. He knew I was going to do it. So he did it for me. He took my burden. He took my revenge. He saved me from becoming a monster. Marcus felt a cold thread of dread. The entire time, he had been looking for a monster, and he had found a hero. He had found a man who had sacrificed his life, his freedom, his future, to save his sister from a path of darkness. The Stillwater 7 weren't the only victims. The Stillwater Silent weren't the only heroes. John Miller was both. A killer who had saved a life. A criminal who had done an act of pure, selfless love. My brother is a good man, the letter concluded. He is serving his time, but he is a hero. He didn't just kill the 7. He killed the darkness that was inside me. He set me free, and for that, I will be forever grateful. Thank you for finding the truth, Marcus. Thank you for giving my brother and my mother a voice. I hope one day the world will see him not as a killer, but as a hero. Goodbye, Marcus. May you find peace, and may the truth be a comfort to you, as it is to me. Marcus folded the letter, his hands shaking. The still, quiet afternoon air now felt heavy with a sense of a profound, heartbreaking truth. The story of Stillwater was not about a mad girl's revenge. It was about a brother's love, a love so deep and so selfless that he was willing to commit a terrible act to save his sister. The Stillwater tragedy was a story of a town's lies and a family's terrible, beautiful sacrifice. And in the end, the truth wasn't a comfort. It was a cold, chilling reminder of the things people will do for love and the terrible price they will pay. The case was closed, but its shadow would linger forever.